No upsetting the nerves, just a nice, smooth drink. Pour it on your glass and just...
Red Skelton could make a whole room erupt in laughter with just a raised eyebrow or a silly voice. To the world, he was the clown who never stopped smiling, the man who turned comedy into an art form. But behind the grease paint and punchlines was a story he rarely shared. A story filled with heartbreak, loss, and secrets that stood in sharp contrast to the joy he gave his audience. The laughter was real, but so were the shadows he carried with him. So what was Red Skelton hiding behind that ever-present smile? And how did his private pain shape the comedy we still remember today? Stay with us, because this is one story you'll never look at the same way again. A childhood of poverty and hardship. Red Skelton spent more than 70 years making the world laugh, whether it was through the crackle of a radio, the glow of a television screen, or the magic of a live stage. But before the world knew him as the master of slapstick, the man who could bring down the house with a single look or stumble, he was just a boy in Vincennes, Indiana, trying to survive. Born in 1913, Red never had the luxury of a carefree childhood. His father died before he ever took his first breath, leaving his mother to raise 4 boys in crushing poverty. To keep the family afloat, Red was on the streets by the age of 7, hawking newspapers and taking on whatever odd jobs he could find. He wasn't just selling papers, he was selling himself, using the quick wit and playful chatter that would later make him famous. People often bought a paper just to shut him up, but even then, he was learning how laughter could turn survival into something almost magical. The turning point came one night outside a small-town theater. A stranger, later revealed to be a performer from the show inside, asked Red what was happening in town. With all the enthusiasm of a boy who dreamed of bigger things, Red pitched the show, not knowing the man was part of it. The stranger bought every newspaper Red had, handed him enough money for a ticket, and then whisked him backstage. That night, Red wasn't just watching a performance. He was being baptized into the world he would one day command. From that moment on, he knew where he belonged. School couldn't hold him. By his early teens, Red was already performing in minstrel shows, on riverboats, and in traveling theater companies. But even when he tried to act seriously, the audience couldn't help but laugh. His body, his timing, and his very presence pushed people to laughter. What should have been embarrassing became his calling card. At just 15, Red drifted into the burlesque circuit, and by 16, he was running off with the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus, the same circus his father had once clowned for. It wasn't glamorous, it was grueling, unpredictable, and often humiliating, but it was also a place where he honed the raw instincts that would later make him a star. By the end of the 1920s, with the Great Depression tightening its grip, Red's path was sealed. He joined a traveling medicine show, first as an errand boy, then as part of the act. One night, he tumbled off the stage, shattering bottles of Miracle Cure as he hit the ground. The crowd roared with laughter. Instead of shame, Red found revelation. People didn't just laugh at him, they laughed because of him. He leaned into it, turning every slip, every stumble, every wide-eyed glance into comedy gold. For 4 years, he lived out of wagons, earning $10 a week and sending it all back home to his mother. When she worried that he was keeping nothing for himself, Red assured her he was fine, that there was always food to eat and a place to sleep. What he didn't tell her was that he was also discovering something far more valuable than money, the secret power of turning his own struggles into laughter. Red Skelton's first heartbreak. Long before the world knew Red Skelton as the master of slapstick and sentiment, he was just a tall, skinny teenager hustling through small-town stages, searching for scraps of laughter to keep himself going. Born into poverty and raised by a mother who barely scraped together enough to feed her children, Red discovered early that jokes could buy more than coins. Laughter could bring him dignity, a little warmth, and sometimes even a ticket to the next meal. Fate, however, doesn't always announce itself with a fanfare. Sometimes it slips into your life quietly, disguised as an ordinary encounter. For Red, fate arrived in the form of a sharp-tongued, quick-witted young woman named Edna Stillwell. Edna was not dazzled by his clowning the way audiences were. She saw past the pratfalls and the painted smile. What caught her attention was the hunger behind his jokes, the quiet desperation in his eyes, and the untapped genius hidden in his timing. Where others dismissed him as just another vaudeville kid trying too hard, Edna leaned in. She didn't only laugh at his routines. She critiqued them, reshaped them, and, in her own way, began rewriting his future before either of them realized it. Their early encounters had little to do with romance. Edna was practical, businesslike, even skeptical of Red's grand ambitions. Yet that skepticism lit a fire in him. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just another struggling comic destined to fade away in the shadows of vaudeville. Slowly, against the odds, Edna began to believe in him. Red was smitten, not just with her looks, but with her mind. She challenged him. She refined him. She saw him in a way no one else did. And soon, what began as a partnership slowly turned into something more. By 1931, the blurred lines between work and affection turned into a vow. Red Skelton, the hungry clown with nothing but a dream, married Edna Stillwell, the woman who would become not only his wife, but also his manager, strategist, and, for a time, the keeper of his heart. Yet love stories built on ambition are fragile. The same drive that brought them together would later ignite a fire neither of them could control. The partnership that built a career. When Red and Edna tied the knot, their marriage was never destined to be the kind where the wife stayed in the background while the husband basked in applause. Edna Stillwell had no interest in being a silent partner. From the very beginning, she became the driving force behind Red's rise. She was not only his wife, but also his manager, his editor, and often the voice reminding him that talent alone was never enough. Where Red was impulsive, Edna was deliberate. Where he lived for the thrill of performing, she was busy mapping out the long game. She negotiated contracts with a shrewdness that made seasoned promoters think twice. She trimmed his routines, polished his timing, and made sure he never left a dime on the table in an industry that chewed through young performers and discarded them without mercy. But it wasn't just business. Their marriage thrived on a restless kind of energy, a constant back and forth where Red's wild bursts of creativity collided with Edna's sharp sense of order. He would dream up some ridiculous skit, or try out a voice so absurd it felt like it could never work, and she'd break it apart, rebuild it, and polish it until the laughs were inevitable. Audiences who roared at Red Skelton were watching more than a clown. They were seeing the output of a husband and wife machine. Behind closed doors, however, things were less seamless. Red was deeply emotional, often insecure, and in constant need of reassurance. Edna, on the other hand, carried herself with a detachment that sometimes veered into coldness. She loved him in her way, but tenderness was not her strength. Their relationship was built less on romance and more on strategy sessions, rewrites, and endless rehearsals. And for a while, that worked. By the mid-1930s, Red was no longer scraping by on the vaudeville circuit. He was climbing steadily towards fame, his name spreading beyond smoke-filled theaters to Hollywood executives and radio producers. At every step, Edna was there, calculating, critiquing, pushing him forward. Together, they were unstoppable. But unstoppable forces rarely know when to slow down, and the problems in their marriage were beginning to rear its ugly head. Red Skelton's rise to fame. With Edna's hand on the wheel, Red stepped out of the cramped world of small-town stages and into the bright lights of Hollywood and New York. The boy who once hawked newspapers on street corners now found himself standing on stages where producers and critics measured every move. Red had something rare, the ability to make people laugh without even speaking. A stumble, a double take, a twitch of his eyebrow, and the room erupted. He was chaos and innocence rolled into one. A clown who could draw tears of laughter with nothing but a look. Edna recognized that talent was not enough. Vaudeville was dying, but she knew Red's charm could stretch beyond the stage. She pushed him toward radio, where his characters and timing could reach living rooms across America. She steered him toward bigger bookings, contracts that gave him not only money, but staying power. She wasn't building a career for him, she was building a brand. In 1937, the gamble paid off. Red's Donut Dunkers routine, his playful take on the everyday struggle of dunking pastries into coffee, became a sensation. Audiences never forgot it. Within months, Hollywood came calling. MGM signed him to a contract, and suddenly, the kid from Vincennes was trading pratfalls with silver screen stars. Success, however, came with its shadows. Red adored the spotlight, but it drained him. Each laugh came at the cost of endless preparation, and every routine had to top the last. The grind wore at his spirit. When the cameras stopped, silence pressed in hard. Laughter, he realized, faded quickly once the lights dimmed. Edna kept him moving. She negotiated film roles, chased radio spots, and made sure his name stayed hot. But her drive, the very thing that propelled him forward, also widened the distance between them. Red craved softness, the gentle reassurance he had never really known. But Edna offered strategy instead. She gave him stability, not comfort, direction, not intimacy. Still, for a time, they were a phenomenon. To the world, they looked like the perfect team. But within their marriage, the cracks were spreading. Thin lines running beneath the surface of all that success. The cracks beneath the act. On stage, Red was flawless. He could twist a simple gag into something unforgettable, a master of turning mistakes into magic. But at home, the curtain fell on a different story. The first cracks in the marriage weren't explosive. They crept in quietly. Red wanted affection, an intimacy that soothed his insecurities. Edna, practical as ever, seemed unable, or perhaps unwilling, to give him that. Soon, their home became less a sanctuary and more an office. Red might come home glowing from a performance, eager to bask in the thrill of the audience's joy, only to find Edna dissecting the set. Which joke worked, which didn't, and how it could all be sharper. She wasn't cruel, she was focused. But to Red, it felt like being managed, not loved. Hollywood's temptations made things worse. Fame brought admirers, parties, and endless opportunities for distraction. Red wasn't immune, and the more successful he became, the more strained their marriage grew. In public, they smiled, a picture of unity. In private, things were different. Red could make millions laugh, but he couldn't make his own wife smile the way he longed to. By the late 1930s, their marriage began to feel suffocating. They had constructed an empire together, but somewhere along the climb, they had lost each other. And though Red still painted on his broad clown smile, the loneliness was eating at him. The clown was breaking, and even Edna couldn't put him back together. By 1943, the partnership that once seemed unstoppable was grinding to a halt. Red and Edna had built something extraordinary together, but the very machine they created was tearing them apart. The end was not graceful. Their divorce was public, bitter, and full of accusations. Red claimed that Edna treated their marriage like a contract, cold and calculating, with little room for affection. Edna didn't deny her toughness, but she had her own grievances. She accused him of moodiness, insecurity, and an ego inflated by fame. The love story that once thrived on ambition had devolved into open warfare. What made it devastating was that Edna was more than his wife. She was his manager, his strategist, the architect of his career. Losing her wasn't just personal, it was a professional suicide. Yet there was no stopping the collapse. Papers were signed, the marriage dissolved, and the woman who had believed in him when no one else did was no longer by his side. Red unraveled. He performed with the same energy, But behind the smile was a desperation that bordered on survival. His jokes landed, his routines dazzled, but privately, he was bleeding. Edna didn't vanish. She carried on. But for Red, her absence was haunting. She had been the one who saw him before the fame, who believed in the boy from Vincennes before the world laughed with him. Losing her meant losing the last link to the man he once was. The divorce left scars no grease paint could cover. Red still wore the face of the clown, but the loneliness behind it ran deep. He would go on to marry again, but the shadow of Edna Stillwell, the first love, the first architect of his success, and the first heartbreak never left him. That shadow followed him into the next great trial of his life, the war that broke the clown. When World War II erupted, Red Skelton didn't hide behind the fame he had earned. He put on a uniform and joined the army. At first, they tossed him into field artillery at Camp Roberts and Camp Ord, but it didn't take long to see that a rifle wasn't his weapon. His gift was laughter, and the army knew it. They moved him into special services, and from there, his life became a brutal carousel of stages, trains, and forced smiles. 12 shows a day, that was the demand. 12 times he had to climb up, put on the mask, and summon the clown the world expected. Soldiers leaned on him to forget, if only briefly, the hell they were marching toward. And Red gave them everything. But every gag, every pratfall, came at a cost the audience could never see. He wasn't just entertaining men on the edge of battle. He was carrying their despair, trying to shoulder the impossible weight of lifting spirits when his own was collapsing. The strain finally caught him. His body quit, his nerves snapped, and even his voice, the instrument that had lifted him from Indiana poverty to stardom, betrayed him. Timing fractured. Words stumbled. His speech breaking into stutters where there had once been flawless rhythm. For a man whose livelihood lived in delivery, that silence was devastating. Doctors shipped him to Camp Pickett, Virginia, with orders to rest. But rest was never enough. Recovery was not about the body alone. It was survival of the soul. There, surrounded by men broken in ways far worse than his own, Red met a soldier everyone else had given up on. The man's body was failing, but his spirit flickered stubbornly, just as Red's did, unwilling to die. So Red did what he knew best. He performed. Even in weakness, he reached for scraps of energy to tell jokes, spin stories, throw out silly voices, anything that might coax a smile. Slowly, something shifted. The soldier laughed. Against all odds, he began to improve. And with each laugh, Red's own voice began to return, the stutter easing, the rhythm slowly finding its way back. Two broken men fought their way to healing, not with medicine, but with humor. By September 1945, Red was discharged. He liked to joke that he was probably the only star to enter the Army as a private and leave as a private. But behind that quip was a scarred truth. The war had nearly destroyed him. The paperwork called it a throat condition. Others said it was his heart, whether physical, emotional, or both. When he returned to NBC that same year, America welcomed the clown as if nothing had changed. The applause thundered, the laughter rolled, and the painted smile went back to work. But beneath the grease paint, Red carried wounds the audience never saw. Ghosts of exhaustion, collapse, and battlefields that lingered long after the curtain rose again. And yet, even a man broken by war still searched for light. For Red, that light came not from the stage, but from love. Red Skelton's second marriage and the death of his son. When Red Skelton met Georgia Davis, it felt like a new beginning. Georgia was a model, beautiful, and radiant in a way that matched Red's larger-than-life personality. She offered him something his first marriage with Edna Stillwell never quite gave: tenderness. Where Edna had been sharp and business-minded, Georgia was soft-edged, nurturing, and more attuned to Red's need for affection. For a man who had spent most of his life hiding loneliness behind grease paint, Georgia's warmth felt like a lifeline. He joked to friends that the only thing worrying him was that he might ship over before he had time to get married. But beneath the humor was urgency. Red had survived the army, survived Hollywood, and survived the whirlwind of fame. Now, he wanted a family. He wanted something real, something that couldn't be canceled by a network or rewritten like a script. When Georgia became Mrs. Skelton, their union was beautiful, and soon after, the couple welcomed 2 children, a daughter, Valentina, and a son, Richard. Red adored his children in a way that almost startled people who only knew him as the clown. Offstage, he was gentle and doting. He would get down on the floor, invent silly characters just for them, and make their lives a stage where laughter never ended. To Red, the applause of millions could not compare to the giggles of his little boy and girl. At the same time, Red's career was shifting. Free from his MGM contract and his army duties, he stepped into a new era, television. NBC gave him his own show, and by 1951, The Red Skelton Show was born. For 2 decades, it became a fixture of American living rooms. Red thrived on the chaos of live TV. He insisted on one take, no do-overs, and if something went wrong, he turned it into comedy. Like the night a cow relieved itself on stage, prompting him to ad-lib, "Not only does she give milk, but also pet Ritz pies." Moments like that made him beloved. He wasn't polished, but he was real, and America loved him for it. But while the cameras rolled and the audience laughed, tragedy was quietly waiting. In 1957, Richard, the boy who was the light of Red's life, was diagnosed with leukemia. At the time, the disease was practically a death sentence. Red and Georgia threw everything they had at it: money, doctors, prayers, yet medicine was helpless against the march of the illness. Red spent every possible moment with his son, trying to make him laugh the way he once had soldiers in wartime. He clowned, he joked, he brought the circus home, but nothing could erase the shadow. On May 10, 1958, just 10 days before his 10th birthday, Richard Skelton lost his battle. For Red, it was the moment the laughter stopped. The grief was crushing. This was not a role he could act through or a scene he could rewrite. His son was gone, and no punchline could soften the blow. Red went silent, retreating into his artwork, filling canvases with color as though trying to paint his way out of despair. Publicly, he kept working, because Red Skelton never stopped working, but privately, he unraveled. Georgia struggled too. Their marriage, once a source of joy and light, began to fracture under the strain of grief. Some sources suggest Red turned to alcohol during this period, though others deny it. What is undeniable is that the loss of Richard built a wall between them that neither could climb. Red buried himself in art and work, Georgia in her own battles. Love could not bridge the abyss of losing a child. Around the same time, Red's health wavered. He suffered a frightening fall down a flight of stairs, and what doctors called a cardiac asthma attack. Rushed to St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, he was declared so close to death that physicians later said if there were 10 steps to death, Red had already taken 9. He survived, but the incident deepened the sense that fate was circling him, striking where it hurt most. Even as his personal life crumbled, his show thrived. He clashed with network executives, especially after NBC censored him for 2 minutes straight, following pointed jokes aimed at an imaginary studio boss. But his comedy remained defiantly clean, with no innuendo and no vulgarity. To him, laughter had to stay pure. He once made sure no line in his show could even hint at a double meaning. Still, the battles with censors were nothing compared to the war inside his own home. Georgia and Red's marriage staggered on, but the strain of losing Richard never lifted. Eventually, their union dissolved into bitterness. Each of them scarred by tragedy they could not escape. For Red, the loss of his son was a wound that never healed. It changed his comedy forever, darkened his smile, and made every laugh he gave the world feel both a gift and a mask. To audiences, he was still the clown who made America laugh through its own hard times. But behind the curtain, Red Skelton was a grieving father, carrying the weight of a silence he could never fill. The tragedy Red Skelton endured. Red Skelton made the world laugh, but behind the painted smile was a man drowning in grief. He could fill a room with laughter, yet when the curtain fell, he faced a silence that was unbearable. The clown who once seemed untouchable carried a secret life shaped by heartbreak, and no tragedy cut deeper than the collapse of his marriage to Georgia Davis and the devastating chain of losses that followed. In the 1950s, Red was at the height of his career. Each week, he performed live, throwing himself into his variety show with the kind of energy that bordered on self-destruction. The spotlight was blinding, but it came with a price. Offstage, he suffered from a painful diaphragmatic hernia, a condition so relentless it drove him to drink heavily just to cope. The alcohol dulled the pain, but it eroded his marriage. Red thought about leaving Georgia more than once, but the ties between them, love, duty, and the shared burden of family, kept them bound. Then came the blow that changed everything. In 1961, their son Richard Freeman Skelton, just 10 years old, died of leukemia. For Red, the loss was unimaginable. For Georgia, it was soul-destroying. Friends said she was never the same. Depression swallowed her whole, and their marriage staggered under the weight of grief. Trial separations became routine, until, finally, in 1971, divorce ended what tragedy had already broken. That same year, the Red Skelton Show was canceled, stripping Red of the stage that had been his armor against despair. In one brutal stroke, he lost both his marriage and his career. Georgia's decline was steady and merciless. In 1966, years before the divorce, she had already shot herself in the chest in what was described as an accident. She survived, but the act revealed just how fragile she had become. In 1972, a year after the divorce, she suffered a heart attack. Her body was weakening, but her spirit had been broken long before. On May 10, 1976, Georgia's battle ended. She walked into the backyard of her Rancho Mirage home, raised a gun to her head, and pulled the trigger. She was 54 years old. The date was no random choice. It was the 18th anniversary of Richard's death. For nearly 2 decades, Georgia had lived under that shadow, and on that day, it finally consumed her. For Red, the loss of Georgia was another brutal chapter in a life already scarred by grief. He had long believed that television executives canceled his show to appease the anti-establishment, anti-war mood of the Vietnam era, and he carried that bitterness with him for years. But even that anger paled in comparison to the weight of losing both his son and his ex-wife in such tragic ways. The man who once seemed larger than life grew older, quieter, and more haunted. Though he lived to 84, dying of pneumonia in 1997 at the Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage, Red never truly outran the shadows. He made millions laugh, but the silence of his private life told a much darker story. What do you think about Red Skelton's life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.